Chapter 9. Examination of the antecedent state of the self. Verse 1. Of the existence of an entity which sees, hears, etc., or which feels, etc., some people assert that it exists prior to its functions. Verse 2. How is it that seeing, etc., come to be of a presently non-existing entity? Consequently, the entity seemingly exists, abidingly prior to its functions. Verse 3. If the entity exists abidingly prior to its functions of seeing, hearing, etc., or feeling, etc., then by what means is it known? Verse 4. If the abiding entity could exist apart from the functions of seeing, etc., then undoubtedly the functions too could exist without the entity. Verse 5. An entity is made manifest by its attendant functions, and vice versa. The functions are known by way of the entity to which they belong. How is it possible for an entity to be without its functions and the functions without their entity? Verse 6. The opponent contends, no entity could exist prior to all its functions of seeing, etc. By means of the different functions of seeing, etc., the entity appears in different moments. Verse 7, Nagarjuna asserts, if the entity does not exist prior to all its functions of seeing, etc., then how could it exist prior to each of the functions? Verse 8. If it is granted that an entity which sees is concomitantly an entity which hears or feels, then that entity will exist prior to its functions. But such a situation could not be in accordance with reason. Verse 9. If again, granted that the entity which respectively sees, hears, and feels is individually distinct, then as there will be an entity which sees, there will also be an entity which hears, but this situation would impose many forms on the entity. Verse 10. Of the arising of the function of seeing, hearing, feeling, etc., out of the elements, the entity too cannot be found to exist. Verse 11. If the entity which sees, hears, etc., or which feels, etc., cannot be found, then the functions themselves cannot also be found to exist. Verse 12. Of an entity which does not exist prior to, concomitantly, or posterior to the functions of seeing, etc., the notions of existence and non-existence are unnecessary.